July 4th, 1776. The newly formed United States formally separates from Britain. The colonies had grown weary of being governed from afar and had decided to split off and just do it themselves. Being the intelligent, forward-thinking revolutionaries that they were, they simultaneously released a set of rules and blueprints clearly establishing the powers, scope, and design of this new powerful government, as they would now have to settle their disputes all by themselves. Just kidding, they didn't even start writing those plans for another 8 days and then took another 3 years past their official deadline just to get it unanimously signed by all 13 colonies, all while still fighting the war that they caused. Oh, and by the way, this new document that they came up with really didn't say much and was essentially just a first draft of what would later be known as the Constitution of the United States. This is the short version of the story behind the birth of the Articles of Confederation and why Maryland, the last to sign, dug its heels in and helped shape the state borders into something closer to what we recognize today. Before any of these dreams of a new nation and self-governance even happened, England was writing charters at the speed of yes. These charters tended to include vague land grants that essentially stated you own from here to over there somewhere, because we don't actually know how large this new land is. Because of this, the colonies of Virginia and Maryland were constantly at odds with one another over the rights and ownerships of land and water. Now, to understand this, we need to quickly recap how these colonies established their borders in the first place. In 1607, the London Company founded Jamestown, and after significant failings in this new world, King James I essentially told the London Company, hey, you're going to be a province of England now, and this new Virginia thing you're doing, yeah, feel free to expand that as far west as you want. Oh, also, here's pretty much everything below you. This worked, and the London Company established a foothold in the New World. In 1620, King James I decided to establish a new colony for the Puritans, and the Council for New England was formed. They were granted all land in America, from sea to sea, that lay between the newly reduced northern border of Virginia on the 40th parallel, all the way up to the 48th parallel, containing much of what we now know as, well, New England. This relocated Virginia's northern border slightly, though it still allowed its holdings to extend all the way to the west. In 1632, however, King Charles I came along and granted George Calvert, the first Lord Baltimore, the bits of Virginia that were north of the Potomac River, as well as some to the east, to include most of the Chesapeake Bay. This was the formation of the Maryland colony. Virginia, however, owned the mouth of the Chesapeake and essentially everything below the Potomac River down to the Carolinas. They also laid claim to pretty much everything west of the end of the river because, hey, how big could this new land be anyway? Almost immediately, land disputes sprang up. This laid the groundwork for conflict between these two states, as Maryland also won control of the eastern shore. Maryland also tried to lay claim to a southern fork of the Potomac, which is now part of West Virginia. However, this dispute was resolved in favor of Virginia. The third reduction of Virginia occurred in 1663 when King Charles II issued a colonial grant for Carolina. 2 years later, slightly more land was given to Carolina that had previously been Virginia's. Now that they would be free of this pesky crown, Virginia would not be told where they could or could not expand. Okay, now back to independence. On June 12, 1776, the Second Continental Congress appointed a committee of 13 to prepare a draft of a constitution for the union of these new states. 1 month later, this was presented to Congress, causing long debates regarding state sovereignty, powers given to this new government, voting procedures, and what to do about those pesky Western land claims. Thanks to egregious taxation and the overreaching tyrannical rule of the British monarch, the colonies purposely prevented their new Congress from having a large amount of central power, preferring to allow the states to retain much of their own sovereignty. Now, most delegates realized that as flawed as these articles were, they were at least better than not having a formal government at all, and so by November 15, 1777, they agreed upon a final draft that retained state sovereignty, left Western land claims in the hands of the states, established state-by-state voting, set forth proportional guidelines for taxes provided to a common treasury based off of the value of the land within each state, and established a single-entity legislature with almost no power over anyone to do anything. Yup, you heard me. While they all agreed that they should pay into this new government, they also agreed that there should be nothing that this new government could be able to do to anybody should they not decide to pay their share. This was 100% based off of the honor system. Now, this worried the smaller non-Western expanding states. Congressmen such as Thomas Burke of North Carolina had made sure that state sovereignty had been maintained. However, this also meant that states were largely on their own when resolving disputes with their neighbors. Smaller states, who had no hopes of further Western expansion, such as Maryland, New Jersey, and Delaware, began to fear the neighboring states, like Virginia, would continue to grow and become significantly more important than themselves. Now, as they had just declared open rebellion against the most powerful nation of the time, the Continental Congress understood the importance of setting up a new government and set the deadline for ratification to March 10, 1778. Virginia and many other states, understanding the importance of getting this all figured out sooner rather than later, agreed, with Virginia signing December 10, 1777, and 9 other states following soon after in the early months of the next year. Maryland, however, dug its heels in. They flat refused to sign until Virginia, who was making various dubious Western territorial claims, ceded these ideas, agreeing to leave such decisions to the newly formed Congress. Furthermore, though Maryland owned most of the Chesapeake Bay and much of the fishing rights thereof, Virginia still owned the mouth of the bay, and as this new government had no real power to levy taxes or regulate commerce between the states, Virginia could technically tax all trade ships entering the bay, regardless of their intended destination, and the only entity that could settle the matter for real was the one they were currently fighting. This only further worried Maryland. As Maryland became the final holdout, several other states became irritated, even passing resolutions endorsing the idea to just go ahead and make a new government without Maryland. If Maryland didn't want to cooperate, then Maryland didn't have to come to the party. More level-headed politicians, however, stepped in and reminded their governments that they were all in this together and would surely fail without full, unanimous support of this new confederation. However, by 1780, the British Army had reached as far north as the Chesapeake. This caused much concern to Maryland state government and led them to write a letter imploring the French to help them. In a letter penned back to Maryland, the French minister replied, "We are led to hope, gentlemen, that the winter will not come to an end without the accession of your state to the Confederation. This resolution is so fitting to endow with some energy the activities of the 13 states, to strengthen their union, and to destroy the shadow of hope which the English may retain of sowing division between us, that all good citizens can see only with satisfaction that the obstacles which have hitherto stood in the way of this accession have been at last removed." Essentially, yeah, it will help, but also, you should really sign that document. Also, during this time, the larger states such as New York and Connecticut had already begun to give up their land claims to the west. And by January 2nd, 1781, Thomas Jefferson finally managed to convince his home state of Virginia to relinquish its western land claims. This did, however, come with a condition that this new unclaimed land would be specifically for Virginians to settle new colonies, states, or settlements. Facing the combined pressure of the relinquishment of land claims by Virginia and the implied strings attached to the French's naval support, Maryland finally agreed to ratify the Articles of Confederation on March 1st, 1781. However, because this document granted the emerging government absolutely no powers of enforcement whatsoever, this would soon crumble, giving way to a more concrete enumeration of the powers of government listed under the Constitution of the United States. Solving that problem, however, would not be the last of the problems faced by the newly born United States of America. In the end, the smaller concrete border-having states such as Delaware, New Jersey, and Maryland, but honestly mostly Maryland, helped shape the East Coast state borders into something more recognizable today. For fear of the potential power of these sea-to-sea chartered colonies, Maryland put its foot down and prevented these comically formed lands from possibly becoming their next tyrannical overlords, gobbling up all land in sight. What would you have done? Do you think that they were right in doing this, wading so far into the war? What would have happened had Maryland not taken a stand? These are questions for another time, as we may never know.